Good morning. Welcome back to Biology 102. We have talked about population ecology, a group of one species and their interactions, community ecology, which is a group of all kinds of living things within a given space and their interaction. And today we're looking at ecosystem ecology, the last layer of ecology. An ecosystem is a biological community, so all the living things within a space and the non-living things and factors that influence it. So if we take a look at this forest, we're talking about not only the living ferns and the trees, maybe the deer and the insects and all these living things within the space, but also the chemicals, things like CO2 and nitrogen and sunlight, these non-living factors that would influence this space as well. If we take a look at our ecosystem ecology, an ecosystem ecologist is often looking at the impact of a specific abiotic factor on a group of living things. So this map over here is showing how different kinds of runoffs, nutrient pollutions, can actually impact primary production in the ocean. And primary production would be the production or how much algae or algal blooms sort of occur along maybe shorelines, but also in the open ocean as well. Another example of an ecosystem ecology study might be something like global climate change, where we're looking at different greenhouse gases like CO2 or CH4, methane, or carbon dioxide, and the influences of climate change on the different living things within a particular area. When we look at ecosystems, then we are looking at all the living and the non-living factors within a given area. Remember, your biosphere is the living layer of things around planet Earth. So all the living species, this usually goes a few miles above the surface and below the surface to get that living layer. And your biosphere is really made up of all different kinds of ecosystems that are in that living layer around the surface of the Earth. So today I want to talk a little bit about some things that sustain ecosystems. So these are processes that sustain or keep our ecosystems running. If we were to lose these items, then our ecosystems wouldn't be able to function anymore. So the first thing that is required for an ecosystem is energy flow. So energy is required. We're going to use that word flow very specifically. And the second thing is chemical cycling. And so I want to talk about why we say those words the way that we do and what they specifically mean. So starting with energy flow, most ecosystems receive their initial energy from sunlight. There are a few exceptions like deep in the ocean, near like sort of marine vents and things like this. But a lot of ecosystems on the surface, energy will arrive at the Earth's surface and be taken into producers that can capture sunlight and build a simple sugar. And then all of your heterotrophs or consumers will eat either those plants or other organisms to gain their energy. As we sort of move energy from one trophic level or feeding relationship to the next, then some energy gets to move up our food chains and food webs or flow through our ecosystems, but a lot of that energy, every time we transfer energy from one source to another, will be lost. And so because of this, we say that energy is flowing through our ecosystems and must be replenished frequently. So if our sun were to die, then we would no longer receive that energy. And ultimately, all of our ecosystems would collapse on the surface that require that passive of energy and that sunlight, because sunlight needs to be replenished frequently in order for our energy to flow. In terms of energy, we would then say that Earth is more like an open system, right? Where we're receiving outside sources of energy frequently in order to run our ecosystems. Chemical cycling, our second thing or major process that sustains ecosystem, chemical cycling is a little bit different. In terms of planet Earth, our chemicals on Earth are more of a closed system, where the chemicals we have on the Earth's surface, like carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, those are kinds of chemicals that we've always had in certain amounts on Earth's surface, and we're always going to have them for the future, so they're more of a closed system. We say that chemicals cycle in our ecosystems. That means they are used and reused over and over again. We use that word cycling because we don't get to replenish these like sort of elements so often. We get negligible space dust and some other contributors, but for the most part, the chemicals that we have on the Earth's surface is what we've always had on the Earth's surface, and so we have to use and reuse them over and over again. I want to talk about how scientists visualize both energy and chemicals and the way they move within our ecosystems. So first off, energy. Energy is visualized through a series of diagrams that show energy flow. And we use arrows to show energy flowing like from this cacti to this bird. And so the arrow direction is meaningful. And some of the energy diagrams that help us visualize how energy is moving in an ecosystem are things like food chains, where you take a small number of organisms starting with the producer. So in the base here, we're starting with these producers, cacti, trees, berries, things like that, products of different plants. And then they're flowing first to your herbivores and then to some of your top level consumers from there. Food chains are typically very small sections, usually 2 to 5 organisms, that show how energy is flowing through a very small number of organisms. It is a chain, so it is a linear representation of energy flow. Food webs are 2 or more food chains that are interconnected. So down here, this picture is actually showing a food web with multiple producers, multiple herbivores or primary consumers are things that eat plants, secondary consumers are things that eat primary, and even tertiary and quaternary consumers that eat other like sort of organisms lower down. These food webs or 2 or more food chains interconnected show more organisms, right, than 2 to 5, and sort of a greater, bigger picture of what is happening in the transfer of energy within a community or a group of living things. And lastly, over here we have energy pyramids. Energy pyramids are these box-shaped diagrams that show how energy is flowing from, again, your producers up to your tertiary and quaternary consumers at the top here. And these boxes are to represent the amount of energy at each of those levels. It can also show biomass, so the amount of mass or biological material at each of those levels as well, depending on your energy pyramids. This energy pyramid, I like it because you can see our energy rule over here, and on average, living things will retain only 10% of the energy as it moves from one level to the next. About 90% of our energy is lost at each of these transfers. With the exception if you see sunlight, that's only 1% gaining on our producers. So we have a lot of producers on the Earth's surface, but they're not as efficient at taking in all of the sunlight that reaches Earth's surfaces and then changing it into like chemicals. So they're even a little bit less efficient than some of these other organisms. But this is the average rule. 90% of our energy is lost at each transfer and 10% gets to move up. Now, just like energy can be diagrammed and visualized, scientists also use diagrams to visualize chemicals cycling, right? And you might have seen like a water cycle or a carbon cycle, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, these cycles in textbooks before. They are called biogeochemical cycles because they have a living component and a non-living component to them, which is why we put them in ecosystem ecology, where we're looking at both of these. So these are chemical cycles with both an abiotic and a biotic component to them that enable us to use and reuse different chemical elements on the Earth's surface over and over again. Abiotic reservoirs can be things like air, it can be things like water or rock material or different nutrients, minerals, and things like that inside the rocks that are housed, like the different chemicals housed, non-living factors housed in the rocks. But these cycles also can include biotic factors or living things. So you will have your producers that are taking in sunlight and transferring that to a chemical form of an energy called usually or typically a sugar or something related to that. You will have producers then being eaten by consumers and consumers eating consumers. And then you have decomposers that can take dead and decaying material and return that those living components back to either our abiotic reservoirs or give those back to sometimes your producers as well. So we see both of these abiotic and biotic factors working together in order to use and reuse our chemicals. We typically divide chemical cycles into global cycles or local cycles. Global cycles are those with a atmospheric component, so some kind of gaseous component like carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide or sulfur oxides that get into the air and can travel quite far across the Earth's surface. Local cycles are those that are they don't have a gaseous component, so they're typically more locally transferred around. Phosphorus is an example of this. It's tied to like rock material and doesn't have a gaseous component. Lastly, when we look at ecosystems and that biosphere, ecosystems often will be given a name. And biomes are major types of ecosystems that we see in that biosphere, that living layer across the Earth's surface. Biomes are major types of ecosystems that cover large geographic areas like tropical rainforests, savannas, deserts, chaparrals, etc. There are two big factors that determine a biome and then some other smaller factors as well. But the two big ones are annual precipitation for an area, so the amount of like rainfall and snowfall, etc. an area gets. And then the second thing is the annual temperature for an area. So how hot and cold the area gets. Those two factors, your precipitation and your temperature, are going to by a great extent determine the biome type of a particular area. And then there's other things like locations next to bodies of water, so how close you are. There are mountain ranges and rain shadows and things like that that can influence a particular area. So there are some other smaller factors. For this class, I'd like you to go through the notes on your own and just review what kinds of temperature and annual rainfall each of these biome types gets, so that on a test, if I give you a description, you could name loosely whether it's a tropical rainforest, etc. Now, there is a study sheet for both community and ecosystem ecology that you can fill out that will help you practice these biomes, and then in our Zoom meetings, we will also be practicing them. This is all I want to say about ecosystem ecology. Again, ecosystems are both looking at the living interactions, but also the non-living abiotic factors and how they influence life on planet Earth. So I will see you next time.